Hello, I'm South Ops meteorologist Jonathan O'Brien. With the calendar flipped to May and the longer days and warmer weather upon us, the start of high fire season is fast approaching, and so today's video will take a look at the fire season outlook for Central and Southern California during the 2026 fire season. Seasonal weather forecasts and fire potential outlooks are of course fraught with uncertainty, but we'll try to organize the presentation here in sort of a past, present, future sense. We'll take a look at weather conditions over the past several months, where we are right now in terms of weather and fuels, and then make some projections for conditions during the upcoming season. Here's a look at percent of normal rainfall across the region since the start of our wet season on October 1st, the blue and purple colors representing above normal rainfall, the yellow and red colors representing below normal rainfall. And as we look at the state as a whole, this wasn't a winter that necessarily had any broad-based patterns of well below or well above normal rainfall across the state, or a very wet north and dry south, or vice versa. All in all, while there was some splotchiness, it was a year where total precipitation, especially on a statewide basis, ended up relatively close to normal. However, if you look at how we got there, it was certainly composed of a couple of distinct major storm sequences interspersed with several multi-week periods of warmer and drier weather. We started getting significant storminess way back in the fall, last October and November, which really took us out of fire season much earlier than normal, and we had additional storm sequences come in towards the new year and again in February, but again interspersed with those were long periods of warmer and drier weather. So overall, relatively near to, in some cases, even above normal precipitation, but with some long warm and dry periods in between. And in terms of temperature anomalies, this was a much more uniform picture. It was a very warm fall and winter, with much of the state averaging about 2 to 5 degrees warmer than normal since October 1st, which is a pretty significant departure in temperature for that long of a time period. So it was definitely a very warm fall, winter, and spring overall. And the real standout in terms of warmth was the month of March, certainly across California, but across really the entire western U.S. as well. Looking at California, much of the state saw March temperatures 10 to 15 degrees and even locally higher above the long-term average, which is truly just exceptional warmth and really unprecedented in many cases. So that was the real standout month in terms of warmth. And so while we did reasonably well in the precipitation department, it was a different story in the snowfall department. If we take a look at snow water equivalent across the Sierra for back on April 1st, which is kind of the benchmark date that we use for seasonal maximums in snowpack, we can see that snowpack was well below normal across the Sierra, with the central and southern Sierra running only 20 to 30% of normal, and even less up north, with almost no snowfall across the northern Sierra region by the time we got to early April. And this was a combination of the fact that the storms that we got tended to be on the warmer side, combined with the fact that we saw so much melting in between storms due to the warm temperatures, particularly in the month of March. And this was far from a California-centric problem. If we look across the entire western U.S. at percent of average snow water equivalent, you can see anywhere in the red shading is below 50% of average, and it's a large majority of the western U.S. that's in that category. Even some of the relatively better areas up towards the northern Rockies and the yellow shadings are still below or maybe just right close to average, so well below normal snow across the entire West, and by many regards, the worst snowpack year on record across the western United States as a whole. Nonetheless, as we look at the latest drought monitor for California, we're not in too bad a shape in the drought department. While we do certainly have a snow drought in place, we have still seen a fair amount of moisture this winter, and don't forget we're coming off of several very wet consecutive winters, so things like groundwater, reservoir storage, which are big components of this drought monitor, those are in good shape, and the vast majority of the state is not in a drought condition, only some patchy, moderate drought up north, and some larger areas of abnormally dry conditions, largely on account of the very hot and dry March. Nonetheless, this is far from the worst we've seen this map look over the past many years, and we're in relatively good shape from a drought perspective. Here's a look at where our 1,000-hour dead fuel moistures have been trending so far this year. So these are your heavy dead fuels, and this graph is an average for the South Ops region as a whole, the blue line representing this year's values, the gray line representing a long-term average, and the red line representing record dry conditions. These charts are available on our South Ops Fuels and Fire Danger website. And if you look at the blue line for this year, you can see the sort of weather patterns we've had. You can see those couple of significant moisture events, one right towards the beginning of the year, one in the middle of the month of February that led to some moistening, but interspersed with those were periods of drier conditions, and that was most prevalent during that historically hot and dry March, where we did see heavy dead fuel moistures fall to their record driest levels for that time of year. We have seen some relief over the past 6 weeks with a more seasonable and at times damp pattern developing, driving those heavy dead fuel moistures near to above normal for this time of year, which is good to see coming off of that dry March. Nonetheless, we do project some drying trends closer to normal as we head towards the middle of May. And the 100-hour dead fuel moistures tell a very similar story. This chart, of course, is a bit noisier, but still captures the interspersed periods of wetness and dryness that we've had so far this year. The very hot and dry March period stands out as well, along with the recent recovery due to some of the moisture that we've seen in April and early May. We've also seen some really interesting trends in our live fuel moistures, and again, much of it is tied back to what we saw with the exceptional weather conditions during the month of March. What we're really seeing across all categories of fuels is that things are trending much earlier compared to normal. In other words, we're seeing earlier peaks in live fuel moisture and also earlier curing processes in the live fuels. Of course, across the lower elevations, particularly here in central and southern California, much of the grass in the low elevations is already cured out several weeks, if not a couple of months ahead of schedule. Normally, we would just be undergoing that curing process here in early May, but that exceptional heat back in March really killed much of the low elevation grass crop. These charts on the slide here are for some of our brush fuel types across central and southern California, and you can see we had above normal live fuel moistures early in the year on account of some of those moisture events that we received and some favorable growing conditions. So we saw good healthy peaks in the new growth back a couple of months ago, but now many of our brush fuel types are well into a curing process, and again, in many cases, several weeks ahead of when that process would normally be occurring. And particularly with that chart on the right-hand side there, you can see how we peaked much earlier than we normally would and are now pretty sizably below normal or below average on our live fuel moistures. And then finally, if you look across the higher elevations, it's going to be a similar story there as well. Of course, up across the high terrain this time of year, it's all about coming out of dormancy, and we're seeing that process in most cases starting a little bit earlier than normal, although the cooler weather in April has checked that up somewhat. But nonetheless, we still expect things across the high elevations to again run a little bit earlier than what you would normally expect, both in terms of coming out of dormancy and the curing process that follows. So now we'll start taking a look at some predictions for the upcoming fire season, and we always like to start with a reminder of what we consider to be normal fire activity for the South Ops region, just to show that even in a normal year, we do tend to be quite busy fire-wise. So we average over 60 what we consider large fires and over 300,000 acres burned by those large fires just within the South Ops region. So even in a normal year, we do tend to expect a significant amount of fire activity across the region. Here's a look at a recent map of what we call sea surface temperature anomalies across the globe. And on this map, similar to some of the maps shown earlier, the orange and red colors represent above normal water temperatures. The blue colors are below normal water temperatures. And there's a couple of features to point out on this map. Of course, you do see a lot of warm water really worldwide, but if we focus in on a couple of particular areas, one being right off the California and Baja coasts, you see some really warm water in there and a lot of warm water extending all the way back into the Pacific. We would expect that to favor strong subtropical high pressure as we go into the summer months, favoring near to above normal temperatures across California and a lot of the west. The warm water right along the California coast is particularly important for marine layer implications. And this map is very different than last year. Last year we had much colder waters on the California coast, which encouraged a very deep marine layer and much cooler conditions in the coastal areas for much of last year. For this year, while we'll still see plenty of May gray and June gloom days as we do every year, we would expect that marine layer to be shallower and less prevalent as compared to normal due to that warm water off the coast. Other areas to point out, you see also warm water towards the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and again in that Baja region. Those tend to be source regions for monsoonal moisture, and when you see moisture in those areas, particularly the Gulf and around Baja, that tends to encourage more moisture available for the summer monsoon. And then finally, I'll draw your attention to the waters around the equator off the west coast of South America. You can see some warmer waters developing along the equator off the western South American coast. Nothing crazy at this point, nothing much more than anywhere else, but it's an early indicator that we are starting to get into an El Niño event, and it's a very different look than what we saw just a couple of months ago. For reference, here's the sea surface temperature anomaly map back from the start of this year on January 1st, and just look at the massive difference off the western South American coast along the equator with much colder water present, and that's back when we were still in a La Niña state, which really was one of our dominant drivers from this past winter was this La Niña, albeit a weakening La Niña, which now has completely faded out in favor of a developing El Niño event. And if we look at a model forecast of sea surface temperature anomalies by the time we get to the end of this year in December, you can see this model is forecasting very, very warm, expansively warm waters along the equator off the South American coast, indicative of a strong El Niño event that is likely developing. And at this point, we do have high confidence that El Niño, and very likely a very strong El Niño event, is setting itself up for later this year and into early next year, and it's going to become the dominant driver of weather patterns, not only here across California, but across much of the world. And while we won't belabor the point too much, the general rule of thumb is that for our portion of California, El Niño winters tend to be wetter and La Niña winters tend to be drier. Of course, it does not always work out that way, but many of our wettest years have come during strong El Niño events due to enhancements to the subtropical jet stream. On the other hand, this winter bore many typical patterns that we see during a La Niña, as even though we did get some significant storm events, we also saw long periods of warm and dry weather, which is kind of what we typically expect during La Niña winters. Again, it's only one predictor of many, but that's typically what we expect during those phases of El Niño and La Niña. Backing things up just a little bit, here's a look at a model temperature projection for the 3-month period of July through September. Once again, the yellow and orange colors are your warmer than normal, your blue colors are your cooler than normal. And you can see the model is forecasting warmer than normal conditions across much of the western U.S., including California, and we do believe that that will end up being a correct forecast for the peak summer months, with temperatures likely to average above normal, even above their usual very warm summertime values. And unlike last year, we expect that warmth to extend to the coastal regions as well. Of course, the interior will still be warmer in an absolute sense, as it almost always is, but relative to normal, we do expect that warmth to extend to the coast as well, due to the shallower marine influence. And here's a look at a model precipitation forecast for the same period of July through September, and in this case the green colors are forecasted wetter than normal values, the yellow-brown colors are drier than normal values. So you can see the model is forecasting some enhanced moisture across California and across much of the West this summer, and that's likely a product of what will be a fairly robust monsoon season once it gets going due to those warmer waters leaving more moisture available, and also potential for activity from the East Pacific tropics. We expect a very active hurricane season in the East Pacific this year, again due in large part to the developing El Nino. And when you put a bunch of hurricanes off the Mexican coast and well off to our south and west, it raises the odds for one or two of those systems, or at least the remnants of them, to move towards California and bring us moisture. So we do expect that there are going to be periodic moisture events through much of the summer. Of course, that's likely to come with lightning and potentially quite a bit of lightning, so we do expect potentially an active summer from a lightning initial attack perspective, though typically when you do get wetter summers, enhanced monsoons, and tropical activity, the net effect of that is a reduction in fire activity, at least in terms of acres burned, due to the beneficial effects of the moisture, even though we still can pick up a lot of new starts, especially in the wilderness areas with lightning activity. And if we look at a model precipitation projection for the November through January period, this is where we really start to see the effects of El Nino showing up, with deep green colors indicated across California and much of the southern tier of the U.S., which is exactly what we would expect in an El Nino fall and winter, likely to be a very active, very stormy, very wet fall-winter season in the 2026-2027 wet season, potentially starting quite early in the fall and carrying through all of the upcoming winter next winter. So here's a look at our latest 4-month seasonal fire potential forecast, which currently covers the period of May through August. And right now we are forecasting near normal fire activity across all months and all PSAs for that period. And if we just look at some of the different pros and cons in terms of fire activity, some of the factors that would favor above normal activity would certainly be the very low snowpack, as well as the expectation for above normal temperatures and that shallower marine layer, and the fact that we are seeing those early curing trends in a lot of the low to mid elevation brush. In terms of limiting factors, the big one we expect to be is the moisture that we expect to be receiving, both in terms of potentially some additional Pacific low pressure influences over the next 6 weeks or so, and then expectations for an active monsoonal and potentially even a tropical or hurricane remnant activity by the time we get deeper into the summer. Another potential wildcard limiting factor could be if we see some earlier than normal desiccation of the grasses, the fine fuels, due to the early curing that we've seen. We may start to lose fine fuel mass earlier than normal heading into the summer months. That's a potential limitation as well, but the moisture is the more substantial one. Nonetheless, again, as we showed earlier, normal fire activity across our region still represents dozens of large fires and hundreds of thousands of burned acres, so we certainly still expect plenty of activity heading into the summer months, but right now not enough confidence to push us for any PSAs or months into that above normal territory. So here's just a few final thoughts to wrap things up. We do expect that temperatures will be above normal across the region through the fall, and that unlike last year, that it will extend to the coastal areas due to the marine layer being more shallower than normal this spring and summer. We expect that the monsoon will likely begin a little later than normal, more towards mid to late July, mainly because we do expect to continue to see some Pacific troughing influences at times over the next several weeks, which will suppress the start of the monsoon. But once it starts, we do expect near to above normal shower and thunderstorm activity, and we're also going to be keeping a very close eye on the East Pacific tropics for potential remnant hurricane impacts. As we head later into the year, there is increased potential relative to normal, but of course far from a guarantee, for significant rainfall to preempt the arrival of offshore winds in the fall due to the developing El Nino event, and if that happens, it would prevent us from having any significant Santa Ana offshore wind type driven fires in the fall and winter. Of course, never something we could guarantee this far out, but it is an increased potential relative to normal due to that developing El Nino, and we do expect that a very wet 2026-2027 winter could very well be in the cards. So overall, for 2026, we're currently projecting a near normal amount of significant fires and acres burned across our region, and we're also watching very closely outside of our region as a long and potentially severe fire season is likely across much of the West, and particularly northern portions and interior portions of the West, due to the historically low snowpack that we see. And that will take us to the end of our seasonal outlook presentation. Of course, as I've mentioned several times, these sorts of outlooks are fraught with uncertainty. That's simply the nature of trying to project weeks and months out in advance, and all we can hope to do at the very best is just to try to paint some of the general big picture trends that we expect for the coming season. So hopefully we will hit on some of those, and hopefully you'll find some useful tidbits to take away from the material here, and we certainly encourage you to reach out to us with any comments or questions on the seasonal outlook or anything in the fire weather realm. With that, we're wishing everyone a safe, healthy, and productive fire season. Looking forward to another season of continued partnership. From all of us here at Predictive Services at SouthOps, thanks for listening.